So I actually wrote most of the script for this video a few weeks ago, but the day that I started filming it was also the day that we found out that Donald Trump had contracted coronavirus, and I decided that it would be in poor taste to release this subject matter while his health was still in question. So I held off for a little while, and if you follow me on Twitter, you know that basically the rest of this month has been taken up by me picking up my entire life and moving to another state. But I'm back, and I'm here to talk about it, and while he may be the most divisive president in modern memory, with yesterday's joint statement between the US, Israel, and Sudan, which is the third one of these agreements that we've gotten within about the last month, the question has to be asked, does Donald Trump deserve the Nobel Peace Prize? My name's Ragabash Dabbler, but you can call me Rags. Let's talk. Now, when doing research for this, the first thing that struck me was how little I actually know about how you get the Nobel Peace Prize. So I had to do a little bit of digging. Let's just bust through it really quickly. First of all, we don't actually know who gets nominated for the prize. The Norwegian Nobel Committee is pretty secretive about stuff. In fact, they don't release a list of nominees until 50 years after the award year. So our nominees for the 2020 award, we won't know who they actually were until 2070. Now you may be wondering, if the Norwegian Nobel Committee doesn't release their nomination records until after 50 years from the nominating year, how do we know who got nominated? Well, people like attention. So if somebody's trying to garner support for somebody or with somebody, a pretty easy thing to do is just to say, I nominated the guy for a Nobel Prize. Because nobody's ever going to know, at least not until it's way too late to do anything about it. And that leaves a lot of room in the public sphere for people who'd like to make a name for themselves or grab a little bit of attention to assert that they have nominated someone. So how do we know who gets to nominate someone? Well, those criteria are pretty broad. Let's walk through it together. The list of qualified nominators is pretty extensive. If you check their website, they revised their nominator qualifications in 2016, and here's what it says. According to the statutes of the Nobel Foundation, a nomination is considered valid if it is submitted by a person who falls within one of the following categories: members of national assemblies and national governments, cabinet members, ministers of sovereign states, as well as current heads of states, members of the International Court of Justice in The Hague and the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, members of this institute that I can't even begin to pronounce, members of the International Board of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, university professors, professors emeriti, and associate professors of history, social sciences, law, philosophy, theology, and religion, university rectors and university directors or their equivalents, directors of peace research institutes and foreign policy institutes, persons who have been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, members of the main board of directors or its equivalent of organizations that have been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, current and former members of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, and former advisors to the Norwegian Nobel Committee. And then they have a little space in here for candidacy criteria. The candidates eligible for the Nobel Peace Prize are those persons or organizations nominated by qualified individuals, see above. A nomination for yourself will not be taken into consideration. Makes sense. So that's a pretty broad pool of people to choose from, easily into the hundreds of thousands of people worldwide, any of whom can submit a nomination to the Nobel Prize Committee. So the Norwegian Nobel Committee fields hundreds of nominations per year. They bring on advisors to help them winnow things down after they've created a short list, and it takes them about a year to go through the full process. So February 1st is the nomination deadline of any given year. If you'd like somebody to be honored as a Nobel laureate that year, the Norwegian Nobel Committee has to receive your nomination for that person by February 1st. If not, it gets lumped into the next year. That gives them all of February and March to come up with their short list and to bring on appropriate advisors. From March until August, they have an advisor review where they actually decide who they're going to honor as a Nobel laureate that year. In October, they choose the laureates, and usually sometime in the first 2 weeks, this year it was October 9th, they announce the Nobel laureates for that year. Then in December, they actually have the prize ceremony, the award ceremony. So who nominated Donald Trump? Well, it depends on who you ask. Now, it's been asserted that he's been nominated multiple times and from multiple sources throughout the last 4 years of his presidency. It was reported at one point he was nominated for his work trying to normalize relations between North and South Korea. He himself tried to take a little bit of credit when last year the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali received the award for normalizing relations between his own country and neighboring Eritrea, but most recently it was asserted that he was nominated by right-wing Norwegian legislator Christian Tybring-Gjedde, and he nominated him for his work in the Arab states in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, the Trump administration's efforts in the Middle East center around normalizing relations between Israel and all of its neighbors. And they are calling this growing collection of joint declarations between the US, Israel, and multiple other nations to be the Abraham Accords. So let's look at what the Abraham Accords are. The Abraham Accords Declaration is available on the State Department website. It's a one-page document. Let's just run through it. The Abraham Accords Declaration. We, the undersigned, recognize the importance of maintaining and strengthening peace in the Middle East and around the world based on mutual understanding and coexistence, as well as respect for human dignity and freedom, including religious freedom. We encourage efforts to promote interfaith and intercultural dialogue to advance a culture of peace among the three Abrahamic religions and all of humanity. We believe the best way to address challenges is through cooperation and dialogue, and that developing friendly relations among states advances the interests of lasting peace in the Middle East and around the world. We seek tolerance and respect for every person in order to make this world a place where all can enjoy a life of dignity and hope, no matter their race, faith, or ethnicity. We support science, art, medicine, and commerce to inspire humankind, maximize human potential, and bring nations closer together. We seek to end radicalization and conflict to provide all children a better future. We pursue a vision of peace, security, and prosperity in the Middle East and around the world. In this spirit, we warmly welcome and are encouraged by the progress already made in establishing diplomatic relations between Israel and its neighbors in the region under the principles of the Abraham Accords. We are encouraged by the ongoing efforts to consolidate and expand such friendly relations based on shared interests and a shared commitment to a better future. So it's not a bad place to start from. Mutual respect, mutual understanding, an agreement to get along in a part of the world that's been torn by war after war after war for generations. I'm on board so far. And to be fair, any statement of an intention to create peace, especially signed by nations that for so long have even refused to acknowledge the validity of Israel as a sovereign state, is progress. In fact, it's what we've been working toward at least since the Oslo Accords and really before that. The Oslo Accords were the early to mid 90s, 93 and 95 agreements that President Clinton mediated between the government of Israel and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and it helped the government of Israel accept the Palestinian Authority at least as a negotiating partner. Of course, that's built on the back of the Camp David Accords, which was the Carter administration's effort to bring Israel and Egypt together, and I believe it made Egypt the first Arab state to acknowledge Israeli sovereignty. That was 79. So when we look at the impact of the three agreements that have come out within the last month or so, we have to take a look at where Israel stood in the Middle East and what political strife that was causing among different nations. So we have Egypt, which accepted Israel as a sovereign state in 1979, and then Jordan accepted them in 1994. Mauritania accepted them at one point and then rolled that back. So right now, up until the last few months, only Jordan and Egypt have really accepted Israel as a sovereign state and negotiating partner in the Middle East. So, while there have been other efforts in the region since there to normalize relations between Israel and the surrounding states, they haven't really gone well, at least until this year. August 31st, the US and Israel announced a joint declaration with the United Arab Emirates in which they agreed to start working toward the normalization of relations with Israel. That was followed pretty swiftly with another joint declaration, this time the US, Israel, and Bahrain, the Kingdom of Bahrain. And then yesterday, October 23rd, we got yet another joint declaration, this time from the US, Israel, and Sudan. So, surface level, it seems like he's kind of kicking ass in the Middle East, which is something that I don't think a lot of people expected from him. In fact, I know one of the criticisms that we've leveled at him for a while is sort of the way he's piled thing after thing after thing onto his son-in-law and just said, "Ah, Jared Kushner will take care of the Middle East. He'll figure it out. He's a genius." And we all laugh and might have to eat our words here in a minute, but not so fast. Let's take a look at each of these joint declarations, and let's think for a second about where these might be taking us. So, in the joint statement by the UAE, the Israel, and the United States, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will link it down where the links go just so you have it. Uh, Mostly, it's a perspective document. We'd like to accomplish these things. It's a starting place. There are a couple of really monumental things in there. First of all, the UAE was willing to immediately break a 40-year trade embargo on Israel. And as a result of that, we know that at least one commercial flight from Israel's El Al Airlines flew into UAE. And this was mostly a ceremonial flight. It was carrying, politicians and dignitaries and members of the press, but it's something. That statement of agreement was followed on October 19th by another joint statement, this time between the US, the Kingdom of Bahrain, and the State of Israel. And again, it was largely a document looking forward. There's very little concrete set there, but it's again an opening of relations, an opening of talks, and again, that's better than nothing. We can talk about the pros and cons, and believe me, we're going to, but essentially getting these people to sit down at a table and be willing to talk about anything at all is a monumental achievement, and credit where credit is due. And then finally, yesterday, there was a third joint statement just 4 days after the statement involving the Kingdom of Bahrain, this time with the Republic of Sudan, Israel, and the United States. And again, it's a foundational document. It's a place to work from. It doesn't really do a lot other than get people to sit down at the table and talk more. But in terms of Middle East peace talks, these are pretty rapid fire accomplishments. Now, the Trump administration has touted all of these as major victories, both politically and internationally. And after each one put out statements expecting that within a few weeks we'd start to see the results of these joint declarations. But remember, the question that we're asking is, does Donald Trump deserve the Nobel Peace Prize for this? And that's where things get a little bit hairier. So if these agreements are so groundbreaking, and if they ultimately look like good things on the surface, what are the problems, right? What is it that people could possibly have against Israel finally being at peace with its neighbors? There are two main things that come to mind. First of all, let's take a look at the joint statements between the US, Israel, and the UAE, as well as the US, Israel, and Bahrain. Because there's somebody that's being left out of those negotiations. Do you know who it is? Palestine. So, the terms of the Oslo Accords were essentially that Israel would agree to give governance of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank over to the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority would agree to respect the rights of the Israeli citizens to live in a peaceful environment, and that they would renounce terrorism as a tactic for getting what they wanted. Now, while two governing bodies can agree to something, that's very different than the citizens themselves maintaining those agreements. And throughout the years, both sides have been seen by the other as the aggressor in the constantly contentious border war essentially that's happening there, the occupation and then the backlash, and that in and of itself is the subject that you could study for multiple semesters in college and still not be done. It's an area and a situation that is flawed and rife with tensions that most of us in the West have very little understanding of without really diving into it. But let it suffice to say that the agreement between those two entities has been less than perfectly upheld. And in the world of diplomatic communication, there's always a little bit of wiggle room left in there. You see, one of the criticisms of these agreements is that Palestine didn't have a seat at the table. However, both of the agreements reference Palestine. In the joint statement with the Kingdom of Bahrain, the second to last paragraph states the parties will continue their efforts to achieve a just, comprehensive, and enduring resolution to the Israeli Palestinian conflict. And in the joint statement with the UAE, it states in part the accord has initiated a historic breakthrough in normalizing ties between Israel and the UAE and has led to the suspension of Israel's plans to extend its sovereignty. The United States and the UAE urge Palestinian leaders to re engage with their Israeli counterparts in discussions aimed at achieving peace. Now, you can look at this one of two ways. You can either look at it as a growing coalition of partners who are coming together to leverage force onto a group that they may view as hostile. But if you're sympathetic to the Palestinians, you may look at that as multiple aggressors teaming up to eliminate your voice and subdue you. So so when it comes to leading toward peace, not giving one of your peace partners a seat at the table might be a flawed approach. But there's also an underlying factor with the joint statement of the UAE that doesn't really get enough press. You see, Jared Kushner, as well as some other Trump administration officials, have alluded to the idea of selling F-35s to the UAE. Why would we sell them warplanes as part of a peace agreement? Well, it turns out the UAE is strategically placed for airstrikes that could suppress the growing threat from Iran. Right now, there are certain geographical factors that limit our ability to directly influence Iran from the air. However, if we are able to sell those planes to the UAE and engage them in a partnership, well, that opens up a ton of new possibilities for us on the geopolitical stage. And as a bargaining chip for being able to sell those planes to the UAE, Israel has also demanded that we beef up their military as we've done for decades. Now, again, this has nothing to do with being anti Israel, but the idea of pumping multiple nations full of either our own direct military resources or selling them military resources they didn't previously have access to, well, it reminds me of a tactic that we used in the Cold War. So during the US's Cold War with the Soviet Union, we were utterly terrified of the spread of communism, and we would wage proxy wars to fight them anywhere we could without being directly tied to it. And one of those wars was the Soviet-Afghan war that lasted from 1979 to like 88, 89. Now, the Mujahideen were a loosely organized group of mostly Afghani forces, but they were joined by other forces from elsewhere in the Islamic world. So as a way to support the Afghani forces and to avoid the perceived tragedy of letting Afghanistan fall to the Soviets, we, as well as several other countries, provided different forms of support to them. It didn't really work out the way that we had hoped because while we were able to help them repel the Soviets, it didn't exactly provide us a stable partner in Afghanistan. In fact, it really just aided and emboldened what would eventually become Islamist militant groups and certain people from that movement you may recognize. People like Osama bin Laden. In fact, when you look at the history of the United States involvement in the Middle East, there are lots of examples of us trying to take advantage of a situation or influence a given situation, only having it turn around a few years later to bite us. So, what about Sudan? You see, the Republic of Sudan has been a state enemy of Israel basically forever. And up until recently, it looked like that wasn't going to change. But last year, Omar al-Bashir, who was the president, was suddenly deposed by a democratic uprising and military coup. So right now, Sudan is being run by this combination government of generals from the military and a civilian advisory board. So is this just the will of the people being expressed? Were the people of Sudan just ready to accept Israel once we finally got Bashar out of office? Maybe not. You see, for several years, the Republic of Sudan has been listed by the United States as a state sponsor of terror. And part of the negotiations in getting them to the table with Israel is that we remove them from this list. Now, that has great financial benefits for the Republic of Sudan because that's going to lift a tremendous amount of trade embargoes and that sort of thing. But was it possibly a move of desperation? That's what a lot of people are alleging. But even still, isn't not possibly a good thing that we're taking advantage of the transitional government right now to set a new course for Sudan? Well, again, possibly not. You see, part of the reason we've had them listed as a state sponsor of terror is because we still have people here in the US who are seeking recompense from them for things like losing people in the 9/11 attacks. And once we no longer designate them as a state sponsor of terror, it makes getting that restitution that much more difficult, especially because we're charging them over $330 million to have their government taken off of that list. Essentially, we're negotiating a settlement on behalf of the country that may invalidate the settlements that people are trying to get for their direct damages. And then we again have to look at the impact on the Palestinian people. You see, Sudan has long been seen as sort of a covert ally of the Palestinian resistance. And while nobody wants war in the Israel Palestine area, this again may be a way for President Netanyahu and President Trump to eliminate the opposition rather than coming to a peace accord with the Palestinian people. So, if we're going to accept the notion that Donald Trump deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for his continued efforts in the Middle East, we have to look at them in totality. Are these truly peace efforts, or are these merely political positionings and military positionings that would be advantageous to the U.S. in the short term? It remains to be seen. I suppose probably we should also look at other United States presidents who have been awarded the Peace Prize and what they did to earn it. Because the Nobel Committee doesn't really give us a lot to go on. In fact, they refuse to put out any sort of criteria in terms of what they judge the nominees on. And the number of laureates changes from year to year based on who they think is ultimately deserving of it. So we can't really even rely on them to set the bar for us. So let's look at the four United States presidents who have received the Nobel Peace Prize and compare what they did to receive it to what Donald Trump has accomplished up to today. Theodore Roosevelt, our 26th president, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905. He received it for his efforts in helping to negotiate the peace in the Russo-Japanese War. Ultimately, he received it for being a third party who negotiated between two warring factions, much like we're looking at with Israel and the surrounding states in the Middle East right now. However, he only received it after he actually helped negotiate peace, not just an intention to someday create peace. Then came Woodrow Wilson. He received the award in 1919, both for helping to end World War I, which obviously took military intervention, but also for being the architect of the League of Nations. He was nominated for bringing people together afterwards, to bring lots of different leaders all to one table. That brings us to Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter was the 39th president, and he served from 77 to 81, but he didn't receive the Nobel Peace Prize until all the way in 2002, and he was awarded it for his decades of untiring effort to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts, to advance democracy and human rights, and to promote economic and social development. So he wasn't awarded it during his presidency. It took a long time afterward for him to get the recognition that he deserved, but mostly because the things that he was trying to accomplish took decades to bear fruit. And then that brings us to Barack Obama, good old 44. He won the prize in 2009, which is the same year that he was inaugurated president. And at least one official from the Norwegian Nobel Committee came out after the fact saying that it was probably a mistake that they gave it to him. That he really hadn't had the opportunity to do anything. And if you know anything about the majority of the Obama administration's handling of international affairs, they probably gave it to the wrong guy. So I am going to throw out one honorable mention here, and that's Vice President Al Gore. Now, he was awarded the prize in 2007 in conjunction with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they were awarded it based on their work to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change and to lay the foundations for the measures that are needed to counteract such change. So again, Al Gore is, he was well out of political office by this point, and he had dedicated his life as a private citizen to combating the effects of climate change and providing awareness to the world, and he has been a world leader on such topics for quite some time. So I think it's pretty clear that if you contrast those people who received the award, those people in presidential offices and the vice presidency, with President Trump's current efforts, I don't think the case can be made that we've seen enough of the effects of any of these joint declarations to really say anything about whether or not they're ultimately beneficial. In fact, the Republic of Sudan won't be able to implement any changes in accordance with any of this for at least 3 years because that's the first time they're going to have an election under the new regime. So while I respect anyone who is willing to step into the Middle East and at least bring people to the table, I don't think the case can be made just yet that Donald Trump should receive the prize. And frankly, when we think of some of the undertones of what these declarations involve, I'm not sure it's appropriate at all. That's about all I've got on the topic for right now. Let me know what you think. Jump into my comments and tell me how I don't know anything about Israel Palestine, or that I'm a Trump hater, or that you agree with me that maybe some of these things are getting blown out of proportion. And by the way, while you're down there commenting, hit the like button or the dislike button, or the like and then the dislike and then the like and then the dislike, and subscribe and ring the bell. And oh, get me on Twitter. I'm on Twitter all the time, essentially just rage tweeting at Marsha Blackburn. But I'll respond to you too. So it's at RagabashD on Twitter. And yeah, until next time, love you guys. Talk to you later. What? Are you helping? Are you helping? Can you lay down? Can you lay down and not make noise and not poke into the frame, please? You're the best dog.